found my grandson Marcus slumped against his car in the parking structure of the Riverside Country Club, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. His shirt was torn, and when he tried to speak, he coughed up blood. I dropped to my knees beside him, my 72-year-old joints protesting, but I didn't care. "Abuela," he whispered, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "It was Blake Whitmore," he said. "He said people like us are only here to serve them, that we should remember our place." My hands shook as I dialed 911, but my mind was already racing backward through 23 years of invisible servitude, 23 years of being the housekeeper who refilled wine glasses and emptied trash cans in the Whitmore mansion. 23 years of watching, listening, and most importantly, documenting. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but the police took their time. When Officer Davidson finally showed up, he barely glanced at Marcus before turning to me with that look I'd seen 1,000 times the one that said we were an inconvenience, a complication in his otherwise quiet evening shift. "Mrs. Reyes, your grandson works here as a valet, correct? Any chance this was related to some kind of dispute with a customer over parking?" I stared at him. Marcus was lying on a stretcher with a possible concussion and 3 broken ribs, and this man was already crafting a narrative that would protect the Whitmores. "My grandson was attacked," I said slowly, enunciating each word, "by Blake Whitmore and 2 of his friends. He needs a rape kit done as well. Blake threatened him." Officer Davidson's expression shifted slightly, discomfort flickering across his face. "Now, Mrs. Reyes, those are serious accusations against a prominent family. Do you have any proof?" I opened my mouth to respond, but Marcus squeezed my hand weakly. "Don't, Abuela. They won't believe us. They never do." He was right, and we both knew it. The Whitmores had been the backbone of this coastal California community for 3 generations. They owned half the commercial real estate in town, sat on every important board, and their donations kept the local police department's equipment fund healthy. The Riverside Country Club itself was built on land donated by Blake's grandfather. I rode with Marcus to the hospital, holding his hand as the paramedics worked. My daughter Isabella met us there, still in her work clothes from the law firm where she'd recently made junior partner. She took one look at her son's battered face, and her eyes went hard. "Who did this?" "Blake Whitmore," I said quietly, "and we both know how this will go." Isabella's jaw tightened. She'd grown up watching me clean the Whitmore mansion, had heard my stories about the casual cruelty of wealth, the way the rich could rewrite reality to suit their needs. She'd worked twice as hard as any of her white classmates to get through law school, only to find that the legal system she'd believed in was just as corrupted by money and influence as everything else. "Not this time," she said. "Not this time, Mama." But over the next 48 hours, we watched our worst fears materialize. The police report classified the incident as a mutual altercation. Blake Whitmore claimed Marcus had been drunk and belligerent, had damaged a member's vehicle, and when Blake tried to intervene, Marcus had attacked him first. 2 of Blake's friends corroborated this story. The country club's security footage from the parking structure mysteriously malfunctioned that evening. Marcus was devastated. At 19, he'd believed that if you worked hard, kept your head down, and played by the rules, the system would protect you. Now he lay in a hospital bed, facing assault charges himself, while his attacker walked free. I sat beside him that second night, watching him sleep fitfully. Isabella had gone home to shower and gather her legal materials. We were alone, and I made a decision. I pulled out my phone and called my younger daughter, Carmen, who still lived in San Diego. "Mija, I need you to come home. And bring your camera equipment." There was a pause. Carmen was an investigative journalist, the one who'd inherited my tendency to see what others missed, to remember every detail. "Mama, what's going on? Do you remember what I told you girls when you were young, about the notebook?" Another pause, longer this time. "You're serious? You kept it all these years?" Every word, every date, every photograph I could safely take. 23 years of documentation, Carmen. The Whitmores think they're untouchable, but they forgot that the help sees everything. I heard her sharp intake of breath. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." That night, I went home to the small house I'd bought 15 years ago, after decades of saving every penny I could spare. In the back of my closet, Behind a false panel I'd installed myself were 4 banker's boxes and a fireproof safe. Inside those boxes was my life's work. Not the laundry I'd washed or the floors I'd scrubbed, but something far more valuable. The truth about the Whitmore family. It had started almost accidentally. In 2002, shortly after I'd begun working for the Whitmores, I'd found a discarded ledger in Richard Whitmore's study trash. Being curious and having learned English partly by reading everything I could find, I'd smoothed out the crumpled pages. The numbers hadn't made sense to me at first, but I'd kept the pages anyway, tucking them into my purse. Weeks later, when I'd overheard Richard on the phone discussing offshore accounts and tax shelters, I'd understood. I'd started a notebook then, documenting dates and times, recording conversations I overheard while I vacuumed or changed sheets. Not because I'd planned anything, but because my mother in Mexico had always told me, the powerful rewrite history. The powerless must preserve it. Over the years, my documentation had grown more sophisticated. When digital cameras became affordable, I'd bought one and learned to take quick, careful photographs of documents left carelessly on desks. When Blake had started bringing drugs to the wine cellar thinking the housekeeper wouldn't notice or care, I'd documented that too. License plates of his dealers, times and dates. The specific vintage bottles he hollowed out to hide his cocaine. I'd witnessed Richard Whitmore bribe city council members to rezone land for his developments. I'd seen Blake assault a catering worker at a party, then watched Richard pay off the young man's family to keep quiet. I'd found evidence of tax fraud, labor law violations, and systematic exploitation of undocumented workers who couldn't complain without risking deportation. But I'd never used any of it. I'd simply collected and preserved, driven by an instinct I couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was the immigrant in me, the woman who'd crossed the border with nothing but determination and hope, who understood that documentation meant existence, that without proof, we were invisible not just in our persons but in our suffering. Now, as I opened those boxes and began organizing 23 years of evidence, I understood why I'd done it. I'd been preparing for exactly this moment. Carmen arrived the next morning with her camera operator, Diego. Isabella came straight from her office, bringing another lawyer from her firm, a senior partner named James Wu, who specialized in civil rights cases and had been looking for an opportunity to take on the Whitmore empire. I spread everything across my dining room table. Notebooks filled with meticulous handwriting, dates, times, and detailed accounts of conversations. Photographs of documents, some showing financial irregularities, others documenting property damage, drug use, and evidence of previous assaults. Receipts for payoffs, names and contact information for other victims, other families who'd been silenced. "Holy shit, Mama," Carmen breathed, her camera already recording. This is a federal case. Multiple federal cases." James Wu sat down slowly, his eyes scanning page after page. "Mrs. Reyes, do you understand what you have here? This isn't just about your grandson's assault. This is RICO territory. Tax evasion, witness tampering, bribery of public officials. If even half of this is substantiated, all of it can be substantiated," I said firmly. I never wrote anything I couldn't prove. Every conversation has a date and context. Every photograph has metadata. Every name has a way to be verified. Isabella was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. "Why didn't you ever tell us? We could have done something years ago." I met my daughter's eyes. And what would have happened? One housekeeper's word against the most powerful family in town? They would have buried me, fired me, possibly had me deported. I had 2 daughters to raise, bills to pay. I needed to be patient. I needed to wait until I had enough, until the moment was right, until someone I loved was hurt badly enough that we had no choice but to fight back. "That's a hell of a long game, Mrs. Reyes," James said, respect clear in his voice. "I'm an immigrant woman, Mr. Wu. The long game is the only one I've ever been allowed to play." Over the next week, we built our case. Isabella and James filed a civil lawsuit against Blake Whitmore and his family. Carmen published the first in what would become a series of investigative articles, complete with photographs and documentation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. But we didn't stop there. I'd kept contact information for 3 other young men who'd been assaulted by Blake over the years, 2 former country club employees and 1 delivery driver. All had been paid off by Richard Whitmore, given settlements in exchange for silence and non-disclosure agreements. With Isabella's help, we contacted each of them. The first, a young man named Tommy Nguyen, was reluctant at first. He'd used his settlement money to start a small business and didn't want to risk it. "I understand your fear," I told him over the phone, "but Blake is still hurting people. My grandson is in the hospital right now. How many more victims will there be before someone stops him?" There was a long silence. Then, "What do you need from me?" One by one, they came forward, with solid evidence backing their claims, evidence that predated their settlements and proved the Whitmores had known about a pattern of violence. Their NDAs became unenforceable. Isabella argued successfully that non-disclosure agreements couldn't protect ongoing criminal activity. The local police, pressured by Carmen's journalism and threatened with federal oversight, finally opened a real investigation. When they searched the country club's wine cellar, they found exactly what I'd documented: a sophisticated drug operation, with Blake using his family's business as a cover. The security footage from the parking structure, which had conveniently malfunctioned, suddenly reappeared when FBI agents arrived with a warrant. It showed exactly what Marcus had described: Blake and his friends cornering him, beating him, and Blake threatening him when Marcus had overheard a conversation about one of Richard's illegal land deals. Richard Whitmore was arrested on charges of tax evasion, bribery, and conspiracy. Blake faced multiple assault charges, drug trafficking, and witness intimidation. Their lawyers, the best money could buy, scrambled to contain the damage, but my documentation made that impossible. Every defense they mounted, I had evidence to counter. The trial became national news. Carmen's articles went viral, sparking conversations about wealth, privilege, and the invisible labor force that keeps America's elite comfortable. Other journalists picked up the story, digging deeper, finding more victims, more evidence of systematic abuse. The Whitmore family's empire began to crumble. Richard lost his business licenses. Properties were seized to cover back taxes and penalties. The country club, facing its own legal troubles for enabling the Whitmores' behavior, was forced to implement radical reforms. Through it all, I sat in the courtroom every day, wearing my best dress, the same one I'd worn to Isabella's law school graduation. The Whitmores' lawyers tried to discredit me, calling me a disgruntled former employee, suggesting I'd fabricated evidence out of spite. But James Wu was masterful. He walked the jury through my documentation, showing how it spanned decades, how it included events I couldn't possibly have known about unless I'd witnessed them, how the level of detail was consistent with someone who'd actually been present. He brought in forensic accountants who verified my financial records. He showed my photographs to handwriting experts who confirmed the documents were authentic. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said in his closing argument, "the defense wants you to believe that Mrs. Elena Reyes, a housekeeper who never finished high school, somehow masterminded an elaborate, decades-long conspiracy to frame one of California's most prominent families. Or, you can believe the simpler truth. She was there. She saw. She remembered. And she wrote it all down because she knew that someday someone would need proof that the powerful are not above the law." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, Blake Whitmore was found guilty on all counts. Richard Whitmore's trial would come later, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus recovered slowly, physically and emotionally. The assault charges against him were dropped. He received a settlement from the country club and the Whitmore estate that would pay for his college education and then some. But the money wasn't what healed him. It was watching justice actually work, watching the system hold powerful people accountable for once. 6 months after Blake's sentencing, Marcus returned to college. He'd changed his major from business to social work. He wanted to help other victims, he told me, to make sure they had advocates when the system failed them. Isabella's law firm, emboldened by the victory, started taking on more cases against wealthy defendants, using my documentation methods as a model. They even hired a memory keeper position, someone whose job was to systematically document everything, creating an evidence trail that couldn't be destroyed or denied. Carmen won a National Journalism Award for her Whitmore exposé, but more importantly, her articles had inspired other service workers to come forward with their own documentation of abuse, creating a nationwide reckoning about how America treats its invisible labor force. As for me, I retired. Really retired this time. Not the forced early retirement I'd gotten from the Whitmores when their house was seized. I spent my days tending my garden, cooking for my family, and occasionally speaking at law schools about the importance of documentation and patience. One evening, about a year after the trial, my entire family gathered at my house for Sunday dinner. Marcus was home for the summer, helping me plant tomatoes. Isabella and Carmen were arguing good-naturedly about some political development. My grandchildren were playing in the yard. After dinner, Marcus and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "Abuela," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Always, mijo." "Did you know, all those years, did you know that someday something like this would happen?" I thought about that question carefully. I didn't know specifically, but I knew that men like the Whitmores don't stop unless they're forced to stop. I knew that someday, someone would need proof. I just hoped that when that day came, I'd have what was needed. "You were preparing to fight a war that hadn't started yet." "No, mijo. The war had already started. It started the day I crossed the border with nothing. It started every time someone like Richard Whitmore looked through me instead of at me. It started every time the system protected wealth instead of people. I wasn't preparing to fight. I was preparing to win." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding. "They never saw you coming," I smiled. "They never saw me at all. That was their mistake." We sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon. Inside, I could hear my daughters laughing, my grandchildren begging for dessert, the sounds of a family that had not just survived but prevailed. The Whitmores had thought we were invisible, insignificant, beneath their notice. They'd thought that people like us existed only to serve, that we had no thoughts worth considering, no observations worth remembering, no power worth respecting. They'd forgotten that invisible doesn't mean unseeing, that quiet doesn't mean silent, that patience doesn't mean acceptance. They'd forgotten that the woman refilling their wine glasses, the one they never bothered to greet by name, the one whose entire existence they took for granted she had eyes, ears, and a memory that never forgot. Most dangerously, they'd forgotten that every house has foundations, and foundations are built by people who know exactly where the cracks are, exactly how much weight each beam can bear, exactly what would happen if those supports were suddenly removed. For 23 years, I'd been invisible in the Whitmore mansion, but invisible people see everything. We hear everything. We remember everything. And when the time comes, when our children are threatened and our patience finally runs out, we have the power to bring down empires. Because the rich and powerful will always underestimate us. They'll always assume that their money, their influence, their connections make them untouchable. They'll always believe that people like me, immigrant women who clean their houses and tend their gardens, don't matter. That assumption is their weakness, and for those of us who've spent our lives being invisible, who've learned to be patient and thorough and absolutely certain before we act, that weakness is our greatest weapon. The Whitmores never saw me, but I saw them, and in the end, that made all the difference.